The rain did not fall, it commanded. It hammered the slate roof of the weary traveler and turned the coaching yard into a shallow, churning lake. From her seat by the window, Susanna watched the last of the daylight surrender, leaving only the distorted reflection of the common room in the glass, the low-beamed ceiling, the sputtering tallow candles, and her own face, a pale oval she refused to truly see. Cold had seeped into her bones hours ago, a damp, insistent chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of her cousin Agatha's smile as Shade announced the change of plans. "A private carriage, you see, Susanna. A most unexpected and fortuitous offer from Lord Ashworth. There simply is not room." Agatha had not met her eyes. Her other cousin, Penelope, had at least had the decency to look ashamed, fiddling with the ribbons on her bonnet. "But our arrangement was for all three of us to continue north tomorrow," Susanna had said, her voice even. It was a discipline learned over 2 hard years. Keep the voice even, keep the hands still, betray nothing, a plan's change, Agatha had chirped, her gaze flicking over Susanna's worn gray traveling dress. The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "You are an inconvenience. You are charity. The innkeeper is paid for your room tonight. A coach will be through in a day or 2, I am sure. You are so very capable. Ah, capable." The word they used when they meant unburdened by our obligation. The word for a horse that does not need to be led. They had bustled out into the downpour under Lord Ashworth's enormous umbrella, a flurry of silk and giggles, leaving her standing in the doorway with the innkeeper's pitying gaze on her back. She had retreated to the common room, ordered a small pot of tea she could not afford, and made it last for 3 hours. Now, the tea was cold. The fire was dying, and the last coach, according to the innkeeper, had been yesterday. The floods had likely closed the roads. A day or 2 could easily become a week. Her savings amounted to little more than a few coins, certainly not enough for a week's lodging and a ticket north. The position as a companion she was traveling to, lifeline thrown by a distant family connection, would not wait. She was in the most practical and final sense, stranded. Ruined all over again, this time not by scandal, but by a puddle in a coaching yard and the casual cruelty of family. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a plume of sparks up the chimney. The brief flare of light caught the high polish on a pair of boots entering the room. They were gentleman's boots, expensive and immaculate. Despite the weather, attached to a man who moved with an unnerving lack of sound. He stopped by the fire, turning his back to her to extend his hands to the meager warmth. Susanna's breath caught in her throat. She knew that posture. The rigid set of the shoulders, the uncompromising stillness that seemed to absorb all the sound and light in a room and give nothing back. She had seen it twice before, in settings far grander than this. In a London ballroom, surrounded by a sea of glittering debutantes, and in a quiet, book-lined study that had smelled of beeswax and authority. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. It was impossible. He did not belong in places like this. He did not travel by common coach or shelter in muddy wayside inns. He was a creature of drawing-rooms and parliamentary sessions, a man whose name was a synonym for power and glacial remoteness. He turned his gaze, sweeping the empty room, as if confirming his solitude, and then it found her. For a long moment, there was only the hiss of the rain and the frantic thrumming in her own ears. The Duke of Wycliffe did not look surprised. He never looked surprised. His expression was one of neutral, almost clinical assessment. The dark eyes, which she remembered as being cold and dismissive, now seemed merely observant. They took in her tired posture, the cheap wool of her dress, the white-knuckled grip she had on her reticule. "A Miss Ainsworth," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was not a question. She inclined her head, a minuscule gesture. "Ah, Your Grace." Twice. Twice he had offered her his name, his title, his protection. The first time she had been the toast of the season, bright and clever and hopelessly naive, and she had laughed it off as a joke, a bizarre miscalculation on his part. He was the cold, unassailable Duke, 20 years her senior, a widower with a reputation for severity. It made no sense. She had thought herself in love with a charming, penniless captain with laughing eyes and pretty words. The second time, a year later, the captain's pretty words had turned to ruinous gossip, and her name was sullied. The invitations had dried up, the whispers following her from room to room. He had cornered her in her father's study. His proposal, blunt, practical, a business transaction, require a duchess. You require a respectable name. It seems a mutually beneficial arrangement. She had refused then, too, with a vehemence that had shocked them both. The refusal had been born of pride and a raw, ragged fury at the world. She would not be a purchase. She would not be a solution to a problem. She would rather sink than be rescued by a man who looked at her as if she were a column of figures in a ledger, and she had sunk. Her father's death, the subsequent debts, the loss of their homemate had all followed in a grim procession. Now here she was, 2 years later still, with nothing left of that pride but its bitter taste, stranded in an inn with the one man whose help she had twice thrown back in his face. The irony was so sharp, it was almost a physical pain. He crossed the room, his footsteps still unnervingly silent, and stopped a few feet from her table. He did not sit. Dukes, she supposed, did not presume to sit uninvited, even when they owned half the county. You are traveling alone. Again, a statement, not a question. His eyes held hers, and she felt an absurd urge to confess everything of the cousins, the non-existent carriage, the dwindling coins in her purse. She resisted. My party was delayed, she said, the lie thin and brittle. He did not call her on it. He simply held her gaze. He noticed things. She remembered that about him. He had a way of looking at a person, a room, a situation, and seeing the scaffolding beneath the paint. He would have seen the frantic departure of her cousins. He would have heard the innkeeper's gossip. He knew. The roads to the north are impassable, he said. The bridge at Stonecross has been washed out. They will remain so for several days. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her hopes. I see. My estate. Wycliffe is 5 miles from here, he continued, his tone unchanging. I am returning there now. My carriage is waiting. This was it, the third time. But it was not a proposal. It was something else, something she could not yet name. Pity, a sense of obligation, or simply the tidy, practical solution of a man who disliked loose ends. She braced herself for the offer, for the cool, transactional words that would follow. She would have to refuse. Her pride, battered as it was, had that one last fight left in it. She would not accept his charity. Not now. Not after everything. But the offer did not come. He simply stood there, watching her. His silence, a strange, weighted presence in the room. It was she who broke it. I am glad you will be home safely. Your Grace, she said, her voice a little too stiff. The weather is formidable. A flicker of something. Semience across his features. So quickly she thought she might have imagined it. Indeed. He turned as if to leave, then paused. You are traveling to the Farnsworth Saw, I believe to be a companion to the Dowager. The blood drained from her face. How could he possibly know that? It was a private arrangement, a humiliating last resort, brokered by a distant aunt. He saw her shock, and for the first time his expression softened. Just a fraction. My solicitor, Mr. Gable, is also the Farnsworth's a man of business. He is meticulous. He mentioned the arrangement. The Duke's gaze was direct, and for a moment the coldness was gone, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like empathy. The Dowager Farnsworth passed away 2 weeks ago. A sudden illness. The air left Susanna's lungs in a silent rush. It was as if the last flimsy floorboard beneath her feet had given way, plunging her into absolute darkness. No position, no destination, no hope. There was no one to wait for her. There was nothing to go to. She stared at the dark swirling patterns in her cold tea, the cup trembling in its saucer. She was not just stranded. She was adrift in the most complete and terrifying way imaginable. She had not been aware of him moving closer, but he was there, his hand resting on the back of the chair opposite her. The gesture was not comforting, not possessive. It was just a there, a solid point in a dissolving world. Miss Ainsworth, he said, and his voice was different now. Quieter. You are cold, and you have not eaten. The stew here is tolerable. It was not an offer of salvation. It was an observation about stew, and for some reason, that small, practical, absurdly mundane statement was the thing that finally broke through her carefully constructed composure. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. What was the point? He saw it. Of course he saw it. He saw everything. But he did not comment. He did not offer a handkerchief. He simply pulled out the chair and, for the first time, sat down opposite her, as if he had all the time in the world. The roads are closed, he said again. Not to her, but more to the room, to the rain, to the situation itself. A Wycliffe is 5 miles away. These are the facts of the matter. He looked at her then, and his eyes were clear, holding no pity, only a stark, unwavering clarity. I am going home. It is not sensible for you to remain here. It was not a question of pride anymore. Pride was a luxury for those who had other choices. She had none. To refuse now would not be prideful. It would be suicidal. It would be an act of performative foolishness in front of a man who valued sense above all else. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was a hoarse whisper, but it was steady. Before I answer, Your Grace, you will tell me the truth, all of it. Why are you here, in this inn, traveling in such a manner? His eyebrows, dark and severe, rose a fraction of an inch. He had expected acceptance or refusal, not a cross-examination. For a moment, she thought he would stand up and leave her there, but he did not. He leaned back in his chair, a gesture that was almost relaxed, and considered her. I was in London, he said, his voice returning to its cool, factual tone. I received word that my son is unwell. Not gravely, but a persistent fever. The letters from his governess became increasingly agitated. I chose to travel incognito to make better time. No ceremony, no delays. His son, she remembered hearing of the boy, Arthur. The late Duchess had died in childbirth, and the child was said to be frail, quiet, almost as much a ghost as his mother. And the fever? She asked, a genuine thread of concern in her voice. It has broken, he said. I received a message from my steward at the last stop. But I did not see the sense in resuming the ducal procession. I merely wished to be home. He paused, his gaze unwavering. I did not expect to find you here. She believed him. It was too simple, too logical, to be a lie. He was a man who moved in straight lines, and she had simply, impossibly, fallen across his path. And your cousins? He asked quietly. Did they know the Dowager Farnsworth had passed? Susanna flinched. The shame of it was a fresh, hot wave. No, she whispered. They only knew that I was becoming a burden. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His jaw tightened for a second, a small, hard muscle flexing just below his ear. It was the only sign of anger, but it was unmistakable. He was angry on her behalf. The thought was so startling, so completely alien, that it jollied her. I see, he said. The two words were freighted with a chilling finality. He had judged her cousins and found them wanting. She almost felt sorry for them. He leaned forward slightly. So, Miss Ainsworth, we find ourselves at an impasse. You have no destination. I have a large empty house, 5 miles from here. That is, for the moment, your only logical sanctuary. I am not offering you my name. I am not offering you a contract. I am offering you shelter from a storm. Nothing more. She looked at his hands on the table. They were large, capable hands, the fingers long and unadorned, not the hands of a fop. The hands of a man who managed things, estates, finances, perhaps even the world. Ah, there must be conditions, she said, finding her voice again. It was essential, this. It was the last piece of her old self she had to cling to. He looked intrigued. Go on. I accept your offer of shelter, she said, her words coming more easily now. It is as a guest, but not as a charity case. I will not be a project. I will not be paraded as some sort of rescued bird with a broken wing, and I will find a way to earn my keep. I can teach, I can manage accounts, I am a skilled needlewoman. I will not be idle, and I will not be in your debt. She had expected him to argue, to dismiss her terms as absurd, a ruined woman dictating terms to a duke, but he did not. He listened, his head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them. Your terms are acceptable, he said at last, with one amendment. Which is, you will eat a bowl of stew before we leave, he said, and for the first time in the 2 years she had known of his existence, the corner of his mouth tilted upward in something that might, with a great deal of imagination, be mistaken for a smile. It is, as I said, tolerable. He raised a hand and caught the innkeeper's eye. The transaction was complete. Not a marriage contract, but a contract for a bowl of stew and a ride in a ducal carriage. And as the innkeeper bustled towards them, Susanna felt not the humiliation of defeat, but the strange, unnerving flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time: hope. The journey to Wycliffe was made in a silence that was thick with the things they were not saying. The carriage was not the opulent, crested vehicle she might have imagined, but a plain, sturdy coach, its interior well-worn but immaculately clean. It smelled of leather and wet wool, and the faint, clean scent of the soap the Duke used. Susanna sat on her side, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, watching the rain-lashed landscape slide by. He did not try to make conversation. He seemed to understand, with that unnerving perception of his, that she needed the silence to reassemble herself. She had been taken apart and put back together in the space of an hour, and the new configuration was fragile. He simply sat opposite her, a dark, still shape in the gloom, his presence a comfort and a threat all at once. They turned off the main road onto a private drive, the carriage wheels crunching on gravel. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of a vast, dark parkland. Then, the trees fell away, and she saw the house. Wycliffe was not a house, it was a statement. A vast, Gothic pile of gray stone that seemed to rise directly from the earth, more a geological feature than a piece of architecture. It loomed against the bruised twilight sky, its many windows dark and blank like vacant eyes. It was magnificent and terrifying, a fortress built to keep the world out. It looked exactly like its master. As the carriage drew to a halt before the enormous, nail-studded front door, it swung open. A butler, ancient and ramrod straight, stood silhouetted in the doorway, a lamp held aloft. He did not look surprised to see a woman descending from the Duca's plain carriage. He looked like his master, as if he had long ago exhausted the capacity for surprise. "A welcome home, your grace," the butler said, his voice a dry rustle. "A gable," the Duke acknowledged with a nod. Has Dr. Evans been?" He has, your grace." "He confirms your assessment. The fever is broken. Master Arthur is sleeping." Good." The Duke turned to Susanna, who stood dripping on the top step, feeling small and out of place. "Gable, this is Miss Ainsworth. She will be my guest. The roads are impassable." Gable's gaze, a pale, watery blue, flickered over her. There was no curiosity in it, no judgment, only a quiet professional assessment. "Of course, your grace." The rose room is prepared. A Noah, the Duke said, his voice sharp enough to make both Susanna and the butler look at him. Not the rose room. That wing is cold. Put her in the nursery wing. The blue room? Eat closer to the fire. He looked at Susanna. And to my son. It was a practical decision. Of course it was. The nursery wing would be the warmest, most lived-in part of the house. And yet, the words hung in the air. Closer to my son. A stout housekeeper, with a severe bun and a surprisingly kind face, appeared, introduced herself as Mrs. Finch, and led Susanna away from the cavernous, echoing chill of the great hall. They climbed a grand staircase, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, who all seemed to share the Duca's forbidding expression. Then passed through a green baize door, into a different world. Here the air was warmer. A fire crackled in a grate at the end of the corridor. The carpets were worn, but thick, muffling their footsteps. The silence here was different too. Not the dead silence of the main house, but a sleeping silence, the quiet of a place that held life. His Grace had fires lit throughout the wing when he heard Master Arthur was ill, Mrs. Finch explained, as if sensing Susanna's thoughts. He does not hold with cold rooms. The blue room was lovely. It was not large or grand, but it was furnished with a simple elegance, a four-poster bed, with pale blue hangings, a comfortable-looking armchair by the fire, and a writing desk by the window. A fresh nightgown and dressing-gown were laid out on the bed. His Grace sent a rider ahead from the last stop, Mrs. Finch said, answering the unspoken question. He is a man who thinks of things. He was indeed. Susanna felt a fresh wave of disorientation. The cold, calculating Duke of her memory did not seem to exist here. In his place was a worried father who traveled incognito to get home faster. A man who thought to have a warm room and a nightgown ready for a woman he had every reason to dislike. After a hot bath that washed away the last of the Rhoda's grime and the day's humiliation, Susanna sat by the fire in the borrowed dressing-gown, her hair unbound and drying in the heat. There was a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Finch, carrying a tray. His Grace thought you would be too tired for a formal dinner, she said, setting the tray on a small table. It held a bowl of steaming soup, fresh bread, a piece of cheese, and a glass of wine. Simple, nourishing, and deeply welcome. Thank you, Mrs. Finch, Susanna said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. It is my pleasure, miss, the housekeeper said. She paused at the door. We are glad the Duke is home. The house is a better when he is here. She hesitated, then added, especially for the boy, when she was gone. Susanna ate the soup, her earlier meal at the inn a distant memory. The house was settling around her, a great stone beast breathing quietly in the night. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had stepped out of her own life and into the pages of a novel. Her own life, what was that now? A series of doors, each one closing behind her. The door of society, the door of her home, and now, the door to the only future she had been able to imagine, all closed. And here she was, in a house where she had no right to be, the guest of a man she did not understand, a man who seemed to be a different person, entirely on his own ground. The next morning, she awoke to a strange and unfamiliar sensation. Sunlight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. From her window, she could see the grounds of Wycliffe, a vast expanse of rolling lawns, ancient trees, and a lake that glittered like a sapphire in the morning light. It was beautiful, a wild, untamed sort of beauty that suited the house. She dressed in her one remaining clean dress, a simple muslin, and made her way downstairs, her heart fluttering with a nervous anticipation. She had made a bargain. She would earn her keep. But how? She found the Duke in a room he called the morning room, though it was larger than the entire ground floor of her old home. He was standing by the window, a cup of coffee in hand, already dressed for the day. He turned as she entered, and his gaze was searching. You slept, he said, another statement of fact. Very well, thank you, Your Grace. A good. He gestured to a table laden with breakfast dishes. Please. Help yourself, I. They ate in a surprisingly comfortable silence. He read a letter, and she gathered her courage. Your Grace, she began, setting down her cup. About my situation. I meant what I said. I wish to be useful. He looked up from his letter. I know. I am a competent teacher, she pressed on. I have a good grasp of letters, history, and sums. And I am told I have a patient manner. He set his letter aside and gave her his full attention. My son is governess. Miss Pringle is a woman of excellent qualifications and a nervous disposition. My sudden return, combined with her own anxieties about Arthur's health, has resulted in her giving notice. She leaves at the end of the week. He stated this with no inflection at all. Susanna stared at him. The timing was so impossibly convenient, it felt like a trap. And, you are suggesting? I am suggesting nothing, he said, his voice flat. I am stating the facts of the household. My son requires a new governess. You require a post. It is a logical confluence of needs. He held up a hand as she started to speak. There would be a contract, a salary. It would be a formal arrangement, no different than if you had answered an advertisement in the paper. Your duties would be to him, your time would be your own. You would be an employee of the house, not a guest, not a charity case. He had taken her conditions and woven them into a proposition that was impossible to refuse. He was offering her not just a job, but dignity, a place, a purpose. All the things she had lost. But your Sona, she began. He is grieving, he is unwell. He may not take to a stranger. Arthur takes to no one, the Duke said, and for the first time she heard the raw edge of pain in his voice. It was the wound he kept hidden beneath the layers of duty and control. His mother, he never knew her, but he feels her absence, as if it were a physical presence in the house. He has driven away 3 governesses in 2 years. They find him difficult. A word for a child who is drowning in a silence no one knows how to break. I cannot promise I will succeed where others have failed, she said, softly. I am not asking for promises, he replied, his gaze intense. I am asking you to try. I have seen you under pressure, Miss Ainsworth. You do not shatter. He paused. And I have seen you with children before, at the Hastings garden party, 3 years ago. Their youngest fell and scraped his knee. You were the only one who did not fuss. You simply cleaned the wound and told him a story about a brave squirrel. You have forgotten. I have not. She stared at him speechless. She had a vague memory of the incident. A small boy in a velvet suit. She had been at the height of her season then, surrounded by admirers. That the Duke of Wycliffe, the most aloof and unapproachable man in London, had been watching her, had noticed that small, insignificant act of kindness, and remembered it for 3 years. It was staggering. He had been seeing her all along. Not just the belle of the ball, not just the ruined woman, but the person underneath. Maisuna's name is Arthur, the Duke said. His voice quiet now, all business gone. He is 7 years old. He does not speak much. He likes birds, books about castles, and the color yellow. He is afraid of thunderstorms and loud noises. His heart is broken, and I do not know how to mend it. It was a confession. A raw, unguarded admission of helplessness from the most powerful man she had ever met. He was not asking her to be a governess. He was asking her to help him save his son. How could she refuse? When may I meet him? She asked. The Duca's shoulders relaxed, a barely perceptible easing of tension. He is in the schoolroom. He is expecting Miss Pringle. He stood. Perhaps it is best if you go alone. An unexpected face might be a distraction. Susanna found the schoolroom at the end of the nursery corridor. The door was slightly ajar. She paused outside, her hand on the cool brass knob, her heart beating a nervous rhythm. This was the true test. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was bright and airy, with a large window overlooking the lake. Bookshelves lined one wall, and a large table dominated the center of the room, covered in maps and drawings. In the far corner, sitting on a window seat, was a small boy with hair the color of pale corn and his father's serious dark eyes. He was not reading or drawing. He was simply staring out the window, his small face a mask of solemn concentration. He did not look up as she entered. Good morning, Susanna said softly. The boy did not turn. He gave no sign that he had heard her. She walked further into the room, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. My name is Miss Ainsworth." A silence. She was speaking to his back, a small, straight, unyielding back. She remembered the Duca's words. He likes birds. From the window, she could see a flash of blue, as a jay darted from one tree to another. That looks like a Eurasian jay," she said, her voice conversational, as if she were talking to herself. They are clever birds. They can mimic the calls of other birds. Some people say they are thieves, because they like to collect shiny things." The small back remained rigid, but his head, she noted, had tilted just a fraction of a degree. He was listening. She did not move closer. She did not try to force him to look at her. She simply stood by the table and began to tidy the scattered drawings. They were all of castles. Some were fantastical, with impossible towers and floating buttresses. Others were detailed and accurate, meticulously copied from one of the books on the shelf. In every single drawing, there was a tiny, lone figure standing on the highest battlement, looking out. "Ah, these are wonderful. Ah," she said quietly. You have a remarkable eye for detail. This one looks like the crack de Chevaliers." The boy's head turned. He looked at her for the first time, his dark eyes wide with surprise. No one, it seemed, had ever recognized his castles. You know it." His voice was a tiny, rusty whisper, as if it had not been used in a long time. My father had a book about the Crusader castles," she said, smiling. "I used to spend hours looking at the pictures. I always thought they looked lonely." The boy's gaze dropped to the drawing in her hand. He did not speak again, but he did not turn away. He watched her as she moved around the room, his expression one of intense, silent scrutiny. The Duke had been right. He was difficult, but he was not a monster. He was a little boy who lived in a castle of silence, and she had just found the smallest of keys. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Miss Pringle departed with a palpable sense of relief, and Susanna officially took her place. The contract was drawn up by Mr. Gable and signed in the Duca's study. It was a formal, business-like document, but as she signed her name, Susanna felt the Duca's eyes on her, and the look in them was anything but businesslike. Her life revolved around the schoolroom. Arthur remained a challenge. He was fiercely intelligent, his mind a sponge for facts and figures, but his emotions were locked away behind a wall of silence. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and he never, ever smiled. Susanna did not push. She learned his rhythms, the quiet ebb and flow of his moods. She learned that he worked best in the morning, his mind sharp and clear, and that in the afternoons, a kind of weary sadness would settle over him. On those afternoons, she would close the books, and they would walk in the grounds, or she would simply read to him, her voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet room. She discovered he had a secret passion. In a hidden corner of the walled garden, he had constructed a miniature infirmary for wounded animals, a robin with a broken wing, a field mouse with a damaged leg, a half-drowned shrew. He tended to them with a fierce, silent devotion, his small hands surprisingly gentle. Susanna did not intrude. She simply left small pots of ointment and clean bandages where he would find them. One day, she found a single perfect yellow primrose left on her desk. There was no note, none was needed. The Duke remained a distant, watchful presence. He never entered the schoolroom during lessons, but she would often look up and see him walking in the grounds below, his gaze fixed on the schoolroom window. They dined together every evening, a formal, stately affair in the vast dining room, just the two of them at either end of a ridiculously long table. Their conversations were stilted at first, confined to polite inquiries about her day and the weather, but gradually, as the weeks turned into a month, a change occurred. He began to ask about Arthur. Not about his lessons, but about him. Did he eat his lunch today? He drew a new castle. It has a garden in the center. He seemed calmer. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm broke over Wycliffe. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the stone battlements of the house. A deafening clap of thunder rattled the windows, and the lights flickered and died, plunging the dining room into darkness. Susanna's first thought was for Arthur. He is afraid of thunderstorms. Before she could move, a figure was at her side. A hand, large and warm, found hers in the darkness. Stay here," the Duca's voice commanded, low and urgent. "A Gable will bring lights, but Arthur will go to him," and he was gone. His footsteps swift and silent in the dark. Minutes later, Gable and another footman appeared, with candelabras, their faces pale. The dining room was once again bathed in a warm, flickering light, but the Duke did not return. Susanna waited for what felt like an eternity, her food growing cold on her plate. Finally, unable to bear the suspense, she excused herself and made her way up to the nursery wing. The door to Arthur's room was ajar. A single candle burned on the bedside table. The Duke was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to the door. Arthur was huddled under the covers, a small, trembling lump, but he was not crying. He was listening as his father's voice, a low, soothing rumble, filled the room. He was telling a story. It was a story about a brave squirrel who was not afraid of thunder. Susanna's heart ached. She backed away from the door unseen and retreated to her own room, her mind in a turmoil. She was falling in love with him, with both of them, with this cold, difficult man and his sad, silent son. It was a foolish, dangerous thing to do. She was an employee, a governess. She had no place in their lives beyond the schoolroom door. The next morning at breakfast, the Duke looked tired, but a strange lightness had replaced his usual stern composure. Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. For what, your grace?" For the squirrel," he said, and the corner of his mouth tilted up in that rare, almost smile. It was a very effective strategy, not just for Arthur, but for them. The long, formal dining table seemed a little less vast that evening. Their conversation flowed more easily. He told her about his plans to improve the tenants' cottages, and she told him about a new book of poetry she had been reading. For the first time, she felt not like an employee, but like a companion, a friend. It was a dangerous illusion. The illusion was shattered by the arrival of a letter, and then, a visitor. The letter was for Susanna, bearing a London postmark. It was from a solicitor she did not know, informing her that an old friend of her mother's, a woman she barely remembered, had passed away and left her a small legacy. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to be independent, enough to leave Wycliffe. The thought, which should have been a relief, was a sharp, piercing pain. Before she could fully process the news, the visitor arrived. He was announced by Gable as Mr. Julian Ellsworth, and he strode into the morning room as if he owned it. He was handsome in a way that set Susanna's teeth on edge, too smooth, too polished. His smile was dazzling, but it did not reach his eyes. Susanna, my dear," he exclaimed, taking her hand and kissing it with a flourish. "I have come all this way to be the bearer of good news." He was, he explained, the solicitor for the estate of her mother's friend. He had taken the liberty of traveling north himself to deliver the news in person. He painted a glowing picture of her newfound independence, of a small but elegant house in Bath, of a life of genteel leisure. The Duke entered the room in the middle of Ellsworth's effusive speech. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene, the handsome stranger holding Susanna's hand, the triumphant look on Ellsworth's face, the bewildered expression on hers. Your Grace," Ellsworth said, turning on his brilliant smile. A Julian Ellsworth. I am Miss Ainsworth's man of business. I have just been congratulating her on her good fortune. She is a woman of property now. No longer in need of a employment. The way he said the word a employment was a subtle insult, a reminder of her dependent status. The Duke's face was a mask of stone. He did not acknowledge Ellsworth. His gaze was fixed on Susanna. Is this true? I have received a letter, she stammered. I have not had time to. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Ellsworth boomed, stepping between them. A new life awaits her. Of course there are some legal matters to attend to. The legacy is tied, in a rather quaint and complicated way, to a parcel of land that adjoins the Wycliffe estate. A mere formality, of course, but it will require a look at your deeds and records. A cold knot of unease formed in Susanna's stomach. Something was wrong. The Duke's eyes never left hers. A Miss Ainsworth is my son's governess, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. She is under contract. She will not be leaving. It was a bald statement of possession, and it sent a thrill of something hot and fierce through her. But it also put her in an impossible position. Your Grace, Ellsworth said with a condescending chuckle. Surely you would not stand in the way of her good fortune? A contract can be broken. I do not break my contracts, the Duke said. He turned to Susanna. And I do not believe Miss Ainsworth does either. However, she is of course free to choose. The choice was laid bare before her. A new life, independence, freedom from the emotional turmoil of Wycliffe. Or this strange, fragile, unspoken thing she was building with a man and a boy who were slowly stealing her heart. Mr. Ellsworth is right, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I must consider my future. She could not look at the Duke. The hurt in his eyes, which she knew she would see, would be more than she could bear. She spent the rest of the day in a daze. Ellsworth was insufferably charming, full of plans for her future, for their future. He made it clear that he saw her not just as a client, but as a potential wife. A woman of property was a very different prospect from a ruined debutante. The Duke was a ghost. He did not appear for dinner. He sent word that he was busy with estate papers. Susanna sat alone at the long table, with only Ellsworth for company, and felt a desolation deeper than any she had known at the inn. She had made the wrong choice. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the library. It was a vast two-story room, filled with the scent of old books and wood smoke. A single lamp burned on a large desk, illuminating a scattering of papers. The Duke was there, bent over a large ancient-looking map, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, and the weariness in his face struck her to the core. I cannot leave, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I do not care about the money. I cannot leave Arthur. It was only half the truth, but it was the only half she dared to speak aloud. He did not smile. He simply looked at her, a long, searching look. I know. What is going on? She asked. Who is Mr. Ellsworth? What does he really want? He wants what men like him always want, the Duke said, his voice grim. More. He tapped the map. The legacy your mother's friend left you is not the money. It is this. He pointed to a small, insignificant-looking parcel of land on the very edge of the Wycliffe estate. It is called the Crieras Holt. It is worthless, boggy land. But it carries with it a charter, an ancient right dating back to the War of the Roses. He picked up a heavy leather-bound book. The charter states that if the direct male line of the Dukes of Wycliffe should ever fail, the entire estate and title revert to the holder of the Crieras Holt charter, provided they are of sound mind, body, and English blood. What? Susanna stared at him, her mind reeling. But your line has not failed. You have Arthur. Precisely, the Duke said, his eyes like chips of ice. Ellsworth is not your solicitor. He is the grandson of the man who cheated your father out of his fortune. His family has been hunting for this charter for generations. He has found it, and he has found you. But the charter is useless to him as long as Arthur is my heir. The full monstrous weight of it crashed down on her. So, he needs Arthur to not be my heir. The Duke finished, his voice a low growl. He needs to prove him illegitimate. Or remove him. The word hung in the air, sickening and vile. Remove him. The child she had come to love, the fragile boy who tended to wounded birds. He has been asking questions in the village, the Duke continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. About my late wife. About the timing of Arthur's birth. He is building a case, a web of lies and innuendo, to challenge Arthur's legitimacy. But that is insane. He cannot possibly succeed. It would not succeed in a court of law, the Duke conceded. But the scandal would be devastating. It would drag Arthur's name, his mother's memory, through the mud. It would destroy him. This was the graver threat. Not social cruelty, but a calculated vicious attack on the most vulnerable person in the house. What are we going to do? She whispered. The Duke looked at her, and he hung between them, a fragile, powerful bridge. He did not correct her. We are going to let him think he is winning, he said, a dangerous glint in his eye. We are going to give him all the rope he needs to hang himself. The next few days were a masterclass in deception. Susanna, coached by the Duke, played the part of the naive, flattered heiress. She allowed Ellsworth to show her plans for their house in Bath, listened to his descriptions of the society she would re-enter on his arm. It made her feel sick, but she held the Duke's words in her mind. You do not shatter. Ellsworth grew bolder. He spent hours in the library, ostensibly examining the deeds related to Cryer's Holt, but Susanna knew he was searching for anything he could twist into a weapon. The Duke, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of quiet activity. Messengers rode out at all hours of the night. Mr. Gable, the solicitor, arrived and was closeted with the Duke for hours. The tension in the house was unbearable. The staff watched Ellsworth with open hostility. Arthur, sensing the discord, grew even more withdrawn, a small pale ghost who haunted the edges of rooms. He would only speak to Susanna, his whispers a desperate anchor in a churning sea. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Ellsworth, triumphant, requested a meeting with the Duke in the main drawing room. He insisted Susanna be present, as the interested party, he said, with a smirk. The drawing room was a grand, formal space, dominated by a huge, heroic portrait of the late Duchess over the fireplace. She was beautiful, ethereal, with a sad, gentle smile. Susanna had always felt her presence in the house, not as a rival, but as a quiet, sorrowful memory. Ellsworth stood before the fire, a sheaf of papers in his hand, a look of vindictive triumph on his face. The Duke stood by the window, a silent, imposing figure. Susanna sat on a sofa, her hands clenched in her lap. I have, with Miss Ainsworth's permission, been examining the rather fascinating history of our two families, Ellsworth began, his voice ringing with false bonhomie. And I have discovered a most unfortunate discrepancy. He proceeded to lay out his case. A web of forged letters, paid-for village gossip, and twisted dates, all designed to suggest that the late Duchess had been indiscreet. That Arthur, born a month premature, according to the official record, was not, in fact, the Duke's son. It is a tragedy, of course, Ellsworth said, his eyes gleaming with malice. But the law is the law. With Arthur's parentage in doubt, the charter of Cryer's Holt comes into play. As Miss Ainsworth's future husband and legal representative, I am prepared to assume the responsibilities of the Wycliffe title. He had overplayed his hand. He had assumed her complicity. Susanna rose to her feet, her body trembling. With a cold, clear rage, "You are a liar," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. You are a despicable, grasping, cruel man, and you will not speak of the late Duchess or her son in that manner ever again." And Ellsworth laughed. "My dear, you are overwrought. You are standing in the way of our fortune." I have no fortune with you, she shot back. And I would rather be a scullery maid in this house than the lady of 100 houses with you. Ah, bravely, Pa. The evidence is here. He brandished the papers. The evidence? A quiet voice said from the doorway. Is fabricated. Mr. Gable stepped into the room, followed by two stern-looking men. Susanna did not recognize these gentlemen, the Duke said, finally moving from the window. Magistrates. They have been listening to your presentation. He took the papers from Ellsworth's stunned hand, a clumsy forgery. The paper is too new. The ink is modern. You even misspelled the name of my wife's childhood home. A careless error, He let the papers drift from his fingers to the floor, and, as for the village gossip, he continued, his voice like the crack of a whip. Man you paid to spread these lies confessed this morning. In exchange for leniency and the return of the money you gave him, Uspritz's face was a mask of disbelief, his handsome features slack with shock. He looked from the Duke to the magistrates, his mind scrambling for an escape. This is an outrage, he blustered. You have no proof. At that moment, a small sound came from the doorway. Arthur stood there, his face white, his eyes wide with fear. He had clearly been drawn by the loud voices. He was clutching a small carved wooden bird in his hand. Ellsworth saw him and saw his last desperate chance. The boy, he cried, pointing a shaking finger. Look at him. He looks nothing like you. He is a pale, weak thing. It was a final, unforgivable cruelty. The Duke took a step forward, his face thunderous, but Susanna was faster. She crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before Arthur, putting herself between him and Ellsworth. It is all right, my love, she murmured, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart. It is just noise. Men making noise. Arthur looked past her, his gaze fixed on Ellsworth. His small body was trembling. He looked at the hate-filled face of the man who would destroy him, then at the calm, beloved face of the woman who was protecting him. He looked at his father, standing like a pillar of righteous fury, and he made a choice. He stepped around Susanna. He walked, his small legs unsteady but determined, across the vast expanse of the drawing-room carpet, right up to the Duke. He did not say a word. He simply reached up and slipped his small hand into his father's large one. Then he turned, still holding his father's hand, and looked at Ellsworth, and in his eyes was not fear, but a clear, cold, inherited ducal contempt. It was over. The room was silent. Ellsworth had been defeated, not by law or by force, but by the simple, undeniable truth of a childish love. He stared at the man and the boy, their hands clasped, a perfect, unbreakable unit, and he knew he had lost. The magistrate stepped forward. "A Mr. Ellsworth," one said, his voice grim. "You will come with us?" As they led him away, a broken, sputtering wreck, Susanna felt a wave of dizziness. She sank back onto the sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The Duke crossed to her side, Arthur still holding his hand. He knelt before her, a gesture so shocking, so out of character, that it took her breath away. Susanna," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she could not decipher. He used her name, not Miss Ainsworth, Susanna. She looked at him, at his son, and the tears she had held back for so long finally came. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming, bone-deep relief. Later that evening, after the house had settled into a shocked but peaceful quiet, Susanna found the Duke in the library. The fire was lit, casting a warm glow over the books and the dark wood. He was standing before the empty fireplace, staring into the flames that were not there. "Reginald," she said softly. Using his name felt both strange and perfectly natural. He turned. The mask was gone. In its place was a man who looked tired, vulnerable, and more handsome than she had ever realized. "The first time I asked you to marry me," he began, his voice low, It was an act of supreme arrogance. You are beautiful, celebrated. I thought to acquire you, like a painting for my collection. You were right to refuse me. Ha, he took a step closer. The second time. It was an act of desperation. I needed a mother for my son, a duchess for my house. It was a business transaction. You were right to refuse that too. It was an insult to you, and to the memory of my wife. He glanced up at the portrait that was not in this room, but was always between them. Loved her. But my grief turned this house into a museum. A cold, silent tomb. I did not know how to let the light in. He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. You came here, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. And you did not try to change anything. You simply opened the curtains. You let the sun in. You taught my son to speak again. You taught me to live again. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the path her tears had taken earlier. I have been a fool, Susanna. A lonely, arrogant fool. I did not know what I was asking for. I did not know what I needed. Do not say it if it is only gratitude, she whispered, her heart aching with a fragile, terrifying hope. Is this gratitude? He asked. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was clumsy and searching and breathtakingly honest. It was the kiss of a man who had forgotten how, a man who was learning all over again. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Susanna Ainsworth, not because you are useful or capable or a solution to a problem, but because you are the heart of this house. You became the heart of my house, and I did not even realize it until I was terrified I would lose you. I love you, too, she said. The words a simple, profound truth. I think I have from the moment you offered me a bowl of stew. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. The stew was tolerable. The stew, she said, smiling through her tears. Was the beginning of everything. Months passed. The chill of Wycliffe receded, replaced by a gentle, pervasive warmth. The grand, silent rooms were filled with the sound of footsteps, of voices, of laughter. Susanna opened windows and ordered flowers. She discovered a dusty, forgotten ballroom and made plans to hold a Christmas party for the tenants. She did not try to erase the memory of the first Duchess. Instead, she honored it. The sad, beautiful portrait in the drawing room now had a vase of fresh flowers beneath it. On the anniversary of her death, Susanna and Reginald took Arthur to the family chapel, and they lit a candle and sang the hymn that had been her favorite. They gave her memory room to breathe, and in doing so, they allowed the grief to finally soften into love. Arthur blossomed. The silence that had encased him cracked and fell away, revealing a bright, funny, inquisitive boy. He still had his father's seriousness, but now it was tempered by his own emerging personality, and by Susanna's gentle warmth. One evening, she was tucking him into bed. He had been chattering away about a book on Roman siege engines. He and his father were reading together. Good night, my love, she said, kissing his forehead. Good night, Mama, he said, his voice sleepy. The word, so simple, so natural, landed in her heart and took root. It was not a replacement. It was a new truth. She went downstairs and found Reginald in the library waiting for her. He looked up as she entered, a smile touching his lips. I have been thinking, he said, taking her hand and drawing her down onto the sofa beside him. A dangerous pastime, she teased. Indeed. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about our bargain. The one we made at the Indea. The one about the stew. No, he said, his expression serious. The one where you agreed to be a guest, and I agreed that you would not be a charity case. He raised her hand to his lips. I am afraid I must break that bargain. Because I need you to be more than a guest. And I find I am hopelessly, permanently, in your debt. She smiled, her heart full. The terms are acceptable, Your Grace. He pulled her close, and in the warm, firelit library, surrounded by the quiet hum of a house that was finally a home, he held her. She had been ruined, and stranded, and lost. But here, in the arms of the Duke she had refused twice, she was found. She had become the woman who stayed,